This is chapter 30, section 7, that has two pieces of reading in it for this section. Those sections are the Solemn Referendum of 1920, which you see there, and then what we will cover here in a few minutes, the Betrayal of Great Expectations. So first, the Solemn Referendum of 1920. That term Solemn Referendum is how Woodrow Wilson viewed the election of 1920. He was not running for president again, but he felt that the election of the Democratic nominee would signal that the American public wanted the United States to be part of the League of Nations. And so that was his solution to the deadlock treaty. And so with the campaign of 1920, the Republicans gathered in Chicago to figure out what the party's platform was going to be and also who their candidate was going to be. And so they devised a strategy where they would appeal to both those in support of the League of Nations and those against the League of Nations. So they're going to appeal to the pro and anti-League sentiment, and do that just by addressing crowds in different manners and what they focused on. So their nominee was going to run on what they termed a teeter-totter rather than a platform. So the idea of a teeter-totter meaning that it could go up and down or to both sides, whereas the platform was just kind of stable and it was what it was. They also decide on Senator Warren G. Harding from Ohio as their candidate, with his vice president, Calvin Coolidge, coming from Massachusetts. So that is a Republican ticket for the 1920 election. The Democrats, meanwhile, meet in San Francisco, and they nominate a governor from Ohio, James Cox, who was a strong supporter of the League of Nations, which would make sense who the Democrats were nominating, as Wilson, obviously a Democratic president, and the League of Nations being his brainchild. So James Cox was going to be the presidential nominee for the Democrats, and the vice presidential nominee was Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Obviously, his name will come up later in this course. And the Democrats, as we've already addressed, attempted to make the campaign a referendum on the League of Nations. With that, Harding did make his stance intentionally unclear, again, to not push any potential voters away. And so because of this, you have, again, both sides, pro-League and anti-League. Republicans thought that Harding's election might advance their cause. And Harding spoke vaguely about the League of Nations. He said he would work for a vague association of nations. So the idea here is a league, but maybe not the one that Wilson dreamed up, is what would be pushed for. And so again, you can see how that how describing it in that way might appeal to both sides. Ultimately, the election results included more votes than till this point, more votes than any election that had taken place, largely because with the passing of the women's suffrage amendment, women had the right to vote. So Harding won in a landslide with the largest voter turnout in history, and he won by over 7 million votes. So you see the exact vote counts there, 16 million some odd to 9 million. And the electoral vote count was equally as unbalanced. That makes sense, that oxymoron. So you had 404 electoral votes for Harding and 127 electoral votes for Cox. Cox's votes were primarily focused on the southeastern portion of the United States. And so this, as I've already highlighted, was the largest victory margin to date in an election. And just kind of also an interesting aside, you had, we've talked about Eugene V. Debs before, getting caught up with the Espionage and Sedition Acts and being put in prison. He ran from jail from prison in the 1920 election and received almost 1 million votes. Might be an interesting internal assessment topic to look at. And so that concludes the first portion of reading within chapter 30, section 7. The second I lied, sorry. We got one more slide over this section. And so what these election results indicated was that the public wanted a change from kind of the moral, high and mighty academic standing of Wilson, and instead wanted what they called a return to normalcy. And to return to normalcy, and again, normalcy, I think during the early, during 1920 election meant when we weren't involved in European affairs like we'd got in World War I. And so because of this, people were willing to accept a second-rate president. Your textbooks says that instead they got a third-rate one in Warren G. Harding. And so Harding's victory does represent kind of the end of discussion on the League of Nations. For politicians and congressmen, it became, your textbook says, as shunned as a leper, meaning people just, it was an issue they wanted to stay away from. To kind of wrap up Wilson, he does die in 1924, but his vision for a League for Peace had died long before that. So the last portion of reading is titled The Betrayal of Great Expectations. And so America had spurned the League of Nations, and this was short-sighted because the United States had helped win the war. But because we decided not to join the League of Nations, any influence it was going to have was completely undercut because it was designed in large part to rest on the support of the United States. And this makes sense when it's the U.S. president's idea, when the United States after World War I is the most powerful nation in the world. And so the United States being absent from the League of Nations leads to its ultimate failure. The League does exist, but it does not have the influence and obviously does not prevent events from unfolding that lead to World War II. So this last section also highlights the betrayal of great expectations. This last slide, I should say. We mentioned this earlier, but this is where it highlights that betrayal of the French specifically. So part of the Treaty of Versailles included a security treaty with France, but the Senate refused to agree it. And so in reaction to that, France wants to protect itself from neighboring Germany. And so they start to build up a powerful military force. Germany sees this going on with their neighbor, and they start to rearm. However, based on the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, them rearming is illegal. And so you've got two countries right next door to each other who do not get along and do not trust each other, who are building up their ability to fight war. This is obviously the ingredients for another conflict, which we do see break out less than 20 years later with the conflict that starts World War II. The United States is hurting its own cause. It should have assumed its war-borne responsibilities and embraced the role of gullible leader instead of burying our head in the sand once again to avoid getting involved on the world stage. And so we were in a position to influence world events. However, we did not take advantage of that position. That is it for chapter 30, section 7, and that is it for chapter 30 notes.